He thought he was just fixing a mistake that wasn't his. Clay Spencer didn't ask for credit when he quietly slipped his card across the counter. He didn't announce what he'd done. He had power, influence, options, but when she looked at him later, really looked, like someone deciding whether the world was finally safe enough to trust, he realized the moment had cost him more than money, and given him something he hadn't earned with position alone. This is the story of two people who learned that love isn't a rescue. It's a choice you make every single day. January in Minneapolis is unforgiving, the kind of cold that bites through your coat and settles into your bones, the kind that makes you question why anyone would choose to live this far north. Clay Spencer stood in line at a small neighborhood grocery store on a Saturday morning, watching his breath fog in the air every time the automatic doors opened. He'd built a software empire by 38. He lived in a sleek loft overlooking the city, drove a car most people only saw in magazines, and sat in boardrooms where his opinion could shift millions of dollars with a single sentence. But standing there, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights, Clay felt the same emptiness that had been following him for months, maybe years. The kind of loneliness that money can't touch. And then he saw her. She stood 3 people ahead of him, juggling a toddler on one hip while carefully counting coins at the register. Her natural hair was pulled back into a loose bun, a few curls escaping to frame her face. She wore a simple cardigan over jeans, nothing fancy, nothing that screamed for attention, but there was something in the way she held herself. A quiet determination, the kind of strength that comes from fighting battles no one else can see. Her little boy fussed softly, and she bounced him gently, whispering something that made him settle. On the counter beside her groceries sat a stack of papers, medical bills, Clay noticed, peeking out from under a bag of baby formula. The numbers were circled in red, past due. The cashier's expression shifted, that particular look of pity mixed with impatience that retail workers give when the transaction is taking too long. The young woman, Stella, though Clay didn't know her name yet, shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushing as she recounted the coins in her palm. She was short, not by much, but enough to matter when you're already barely holding on. Enough to make the moment stretch into something humiliating. Clay watched her shoulders tense, watched her glance down at her son, then back at the groceries she'd carefully selected. And he knew, he just knew, she was calculating which items she could put back without compromising what her child needed. That's the mathematics of poverty, the cruel arithmetic that forces you to choose between eating and everything else. He didn't think, he just moved. When it was his turn at the register, Clay paid for his own items first. Then, casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he nodded toward the woman who was now standing by the door, trying to soothe her increasingly fussy toddler. Whatever she was short, he said quietly to the cashier, "Add it to mine." The cashier blinked. "Sir, she already left." "I know." Clay slid his card across the counter again. "Just do it." He signed the receipt, winked at the confused cashier, and walked out without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement or anything that might make the gesture feel like what it actually was, a lifeline thrown to a stranger drowning in a moment she didn't ask for. That evening, as snow began to fall again over Minneapolis, 2 people sat in very different spaces, thinking about the same moment. Stella held her son Miles close in their small apartment, her mother's weathered hand resting on her shoulder as they prayed together at the kitchen table. She didn't know who had helped her, didn't know his name or his face or why someone would care enough to step in, but she felt it, that unexpected mercy settling into her chest like warmth after being cold for too long. She made a promise to herself, whispered into the quiet. One day, somehow, she would repay that kindness. Meanwhile, Clay drove through snow-covered streets back to his loft that overlooked a city full of lights but felt empty of life. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel charitable. He felt something else, a small crack in the wall he'd built around his own loneliness. His grandmother had raised him on stories about love and dignity, about showing up for people not because they could pay you back, but because it was the right thing to do. She'd been gone for 3 years now, and Clay had spent most of that time wondering if being successful meant anything at all if you had no one to share it with. He didn't know it yet, but that moment in the grocery store, that split second decision to help a stranger, had set something in motion, something that couldn't be undone. 2 weeks would pass before their paths crossed again. 2 weeks before Clay walked into the local library and heard a voice reading aloud to children, bringing storybook characters to life with such tenderness that he stopped in his tracks. 2 weeks before he recognized the same cardigan, the same gentle determination, the same woman who was teaching him without knowing it that wealth means nothing compared to the richness of simply showing up for someone else. But here's what Clay didn't understand yet, what neither of them understood. As they sat in their separate spaces that January evening, the debt he'd paid wasn't just hers. It was his too. And the real question wasn't whether she could ever repay him. The question was, could two people who'd learned to survive alone ever learn to build something together? 2 weeks can change everything. Clay Spencer walked into the Minneapolis Public Library on a Tuesday afternoon with no expectations beyond checking on a children's reading program he'd quietly funded. He'd written the check months ago, the way wealthy people do when they want to feel like they're contributing to something meaningful without actually getting their hands dirty. But that day, that particular afternoon, when sunlight filtered through tall windows and cast geometric patterns across worn hardwood floors, everything shifted, because he heard her voice before he saw her. It was soft but animated, rising and falling with the rhythm of a story being told to children who believed every word. Clay followed the sound through rows of books until he reached the children's section, and there she was, kneeling on the floor beside her son, surrounded by a small cluster of kids sitting cross-legged on a faded rug, reading from a tattered picture book with the kind of passion that made fictional characters feel real. She wore the same cardigan, the same gentle determination in her eyes. And Clay felt something click into place, a recognition that went deeper than just remembering her face from the grocery store. This was the woman he'd helped, the stranger who'd been counting coins while the world watched. But here, in this moment, she wasn't struggling. She was magnificent. When the reading session ended and parents began collecting their children, Clay found himself walking toward her before his brain could offer reasons why it was a bad idea. She was packing books into a canvas bag, while Miles tugged on her sleeve, asking for juice in that insistent way toddlers have of making requests sound like emergencies. "Hi," Clay said, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm Clay." She looked up, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered across her face. Recognition maybe, or confusion, or the particular wariness that comes from being a woman approached by a stranger in a public space. "Hello," she replied carefully, straightening to her full height, which was considerably shorter than his 6-foot frame. "Thank you for saying so." He'd complimented her reading, he realized, though he didn't remember forming the words. Social autopilot, the same skill that got him through business dinners and networking events. "I'm Stella," she added, after a pause that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Miles waved shyly from behind her leg, and just like that, the stranger had a name. They talked for maybe 10 minutes, surface-level conversation about books and community programs and how important it was for kids to see reading as adventure rather than obligation. Clay mentioned his donation to the reading fund, immediately regretting it because it sounded like bragging, but Stella's eyes lit up with genuine gratitude that made the awkwardness worth it. "That means a lot to me," she said softly. "Reading with Miles is one of our happiest moments." There was something in the way she said it, like happiness was rationed carefully in her life, like she'd learned to find joy in small, precious moments because the big ones were too expensive. Clay wanted to know everything, wanted to understand how someone could radiate such warmth while clearly carrying so much weight. But he also knew better than to push. So instead, he took a risk that felt simultaneously natural and terrifying. "Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime?" he asked, then immediately added, "Just as friends. You seem like someone I'd like to know better." Stella hesitated. He watched her mental calculation happen in real time. Single mother, strange man, what are his intentions? Is this safe? Can I afford the time? What would my mother say? All the questions women have to ask themselves that men never think about. Thank you, Clay, she finally said, and her smile was cautious but real. Maybe when things aren't as crazy at home, I'd like that. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And for Clay Spencer, who'd spent years getting exactly what he wanted in boardrooms and negotiations, that uncertain middle ground felt like the most honest thing anyone had offered him in years. Here's what nobody tells you about building something real. It doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in the margins, in the spaces between planned moments, in accidental encounters that stop feeling accidental after the third or fourth time. Over the next few weeks, Clay and Stella's paths crossed with increasing frequency. The park near Miles's daycare became neutral territory, a place where Clay could coincidentally be taking a walk when Stella arrived for pickup. Community events for families suddenly appeared on Clay's calendar, events he would have ignored 6 months ago, but now attended with the focused determination of someone on a mission he hadn't quite admitted to himself yet. And every single time, he greeted Miles with an enthusiastic "Hey there, little man." That made the toddler dissolve into giggles. Children are the ultimate lie detectors. They sense insincerity the way animals sense fear. And Miles, for whatever reason, had decided Clay was safe. He would toddle over with his toys, demanding attention in that imperious way toddlers have of treating adults like servants who exist solely for their entertainment. Clay would crouch down, getting grass stains on his expensive pants, building block towers for Miles to knock down with gleeful destruction. And Stella would watch, arms crossed, a small smile playing at her lips like she was trying not to let herself hope for something she couldn't quite name yet. Slowly, so slowly it felt like watching ice melt, Stella began to open up. Small details at first. She worked as a librarian at a local elementary school. She'd been married once, briefly, to a man who'd left when Miles was 6 months old. Left without explanation, without child support, without looking back. She'd built her life from those ruins, working full-time, raising her son, living with her mother Nana Joy because 2 incomes were barely enough to cover rent and daycare and the endless small expenses that pile up when you're raising a child alone. "I'm proud of what I've built," Stella told him one afternoon, sitting on a park bench, while Miles chased pigeons with the single-minded determination of a tiny hunter. "I don't need saving." She said it like a warning, like she'd encountered men before who saw single mothers as projects to fix rather than people to know. Clay understood the message. "I'm not here to save anyone," he replied carefully. "I'm barely keeping myself together most days." That made her laugh, a real laugh, not the polite social sound people make when they're being accommodating. "You, Mr. Successful Software Entrepreneur who donates to children's reading programs, you looked me up," Clay said, surprised and oddly pleased. Stella's cheeks flushed. "I Googled you. Sorry. Single mom instincts. I had to make sure you weren't a serial killer. And jury's still out." They both laughed then, and the wall between them cracked a little wider. Clay started sharing pieces of himself too, carefully curated at first. The safe stories about growing up in Minneapolis, about the grandmother who'd raised him with stories and unconditional love, about building his company from nothing into something that mattered. But gradually, late at night when they'd text after Miles was asleep, the real stuff emerged. The loneliness, the fear that he'd spent so long pursuing success that he'd forgotten how to pursue meaning. The way his grandmother's death had left a hole in his life that money couldn't fill no matter how much of it he threw at the problem. "I think I've been running from something," he confessed one night, sitting in his car outside her apartment after walking her home from a community dinner. Rain drummed on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound that made honesty feel safer. "Running towards success because I was terrified of being poor like my parents were, like money was the only thing that could prove I mattered." Stella was quiet for a long moment, watching rain slide down the windshield. "And does it?" she finally asked. "Prove you matter?" "No," Clay said simply. It just proves I'm good at making money. That's when he started doing small things. Not big, showy gestures that would make Stella uncomfortable or feel indebted. Just showing up. He'd bring an extra book for Miles when they met at the park. Always something. Educational but fun. Always something that made the boy's eyes light up. When Stella mentioned Miles wanted to take an art class but the timing didn't work with her schedule, Clay quietly arranged for a class that fit her hours and covered the registration fee through an anonymous scholarship. He brought warm blankets when winter nights grew cold, claiming he'd bought two. Many and didn't have storage space, which was obviously a lie but a kind one. Each time, Stella would thank him with that particular blend of gratitude and discomfort that people feel when they're not used to receiving help. Her pride was a living thing between them, fierce and protective and absolutely unwilling to bend. I can manage, she'd insist, even when clearly she couldn't. Even when managing meant choosing between heating and groceries, between Miles's needs and her own. Clay never pushed, never made it about charity or fixing or saving. He just cared. And somehow, impossibly, that made all the difference. Stella found herself looking forward to seeing Clay's familiar smile after the library closed for the day. Found herself checking her phone more often, hoping for his texts. Found herself telling Nana Joy about him in carefully casual ways that fooled absolutely no one. Her mother, a woman of unshakable faith and even more unshakable intuition, had taken a liking to Clay's quiet manners. She'd invite him for tea, pepper him with questions disguised as small talk, test his character in ways only a mother protecting her daughter could. "What are your intentions with my Stella?" Nana Joy asked him one Sunday afternoon, direct as a hammer. Clay didn't flinch. "To be someone she can count on," he said simply. "If she'll let me." Nana Joy studied him over the rim of her teacup, seeing something that satisfied her. "Good," she said finally, "because that girl has been counting on herself for too long. Everybody needs somebody. But here's the thing about walls built from necessity. They don't come down just because someone is kind. They come down when trust is earned, slowly over time, through consistency and presence, and the thousand small choices that prove someone isn't going to disappear when things get hard." And things were about to get hard. Spring arrived like a promise, flowers blooming, days lengthening, the kind of weather that makes you believe in new beginnings. Clay and Stella had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural, easy, like they'd known each other for years rather than months. They'd sit together on the low wooden fence near Miles's daycare playground, watching him chase butterflies and shriek with the pure joy only children can access. Sometimes they'd talk for hours. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. It was on one of those mild spring evenings, with golden hour light, painting everything warm, that Clay decided to tell her the truth. His hands were shaking. He noticed that first, the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for Stella's hand. She let him take it, her expression curious but cautious, always cautious. Miles was far enough away to give them privacy, but close enough that Stella could intervene if he decided to eat something he shouldn't or climb something too tall. "I have something to admit," Clay said quietly, the words catching in his throat like they didn't want to come out. "Something I should have told you before now." Stella's face shifted. Guard up. Walls reinforced. "Okay," she said carefully, already bracing for disappointment because that's what life had taught her to expect. That day at the grocery store, Clay continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "When you were short at the register, that was me. I paid the rest, anonymously. And there was also a library fine on your account. I paid that too. I wanted to help. I didn't want credit or thanks or anything. I just couldn't stand by and watch you struggle when I had the means to make it easier." The silence that followed felt like falling. Stella pulled her hand back, her expression cycling through emotions too fast for Clay to track them all. Embarrassment, shame, anger, maybe, or maybe something else entirely. "You were watching me struggle," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That whole time you knew." When we met at the library, when we started spending time together, you knew I was the woman who couldn't afford her groceries. Stella, no, that's not. Clay started, but she cut him off. I was so ashamed that day. Tears gathered in her eyes, threatening to spill, standing there counting coins while everyone watched, wondering which things I could put back without Miles noticing. And you saw all of that. I saw someone taking care of her child, Clay said firmly, desperately. I saw someone doing everything right with nothing to work with. I saw strength and dignity and love, Stella. That's what I saw. She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. You didn't need to do that. I know. I would have figured it out. I know that too. Clay reached for her hand again, relief flooding through him when she let him. I promise this doesn't change anything between us. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel obligated or indebted. I'm telling you because I don't want there to be secrets. You deserve to know the truth about how we started. Stella looked at him for a long moment, really looked, and Clay felt stripped bare under that gaze. She was evaluating, calculating, deciding whether she could trust this, trust him, trust the vulnerability of letting someone see her at her lowest and still choosing to stay. Okay, she finally whispered. Okay. They hugged then, gentle and tentative, and Clay felt something fundamental shift between them. A deepening, like they'd crossed some invisible threshold from friendship into something that had the potential to become more, if they were brave enough, if they were careful enough, if the world would let them. But the world, as it turns out, has opinions about who gets to love whom. Here's a truth that shouldn't still be true in the 21st century, but is: people talk. They judge. They make assumptions based on what they see rather than what they know. And when a wealthy white man starts spending time with a young black single mother, certain people draw certain conclusions that say more about them than about the people they're judging. Clay's business partner Marcus was one of those people. Marcus had known Clay for a decade. They'd built the company together, survived the startup years when success felt impossible and failure felt inevitable. They were friends, or something like friends, in that surface-level way that men sometimes are when they bond over work rather than genuine connection. Marcus was a good guy, mostly. He laughed too loud, drank too much at company events, and had the particular blindness. That comes from privilege so ingrained you don't even recognize it as privilege. So, when Marcus teased Clay one afternoon about playing house with the single mom, he probably thought he was being funny, probably thought it was the kind of locker room banter men are supposed to engage in, probably didn't think about how his words would sound to anyone outside their conference room. "Come on, man," Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair with a grin that made Clay's stomach turn. "You're really going all in on this domestic thing? What's next? You gonna marry the nanny?" "She's not a nanny," Clay said, his voice colder than he intended. "Her name is Stella." Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, okay. Stella. I'm just saying, you've been MIA from the office a lot lately. The guys are starting to wonder if you're having some kind of midlife crisis, dating someone with a kid, playing daddy. It's just not very you. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." "Maybe." Marcus shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. "Just don't let her take advantage, all right? Women like that, they see a guy with money and—" "Stop." Clay stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't want to hear the rest of that sentence." But the damage was done. Not to Clay. He didn't care what Marcus thought. The damage was done when Marcus, in a moment of careless stupidity, accidentally called Stella while trying to reach Clay. When the call connected, and Marcus, thinking he was leaving a voicemail, continued his thoughtless commentary, Clay's nanny probably has him wrapped around her finger by now. Kid's a cute prop for securing the bag. Stella heard just enough before Marcus realized his mistake and hung up. Just enough to make her wonder if everyone saw her that way. Just enough to make all her old insecurities come roaring back with teeth bared. She confronted Clay that evening, tears already streaming down her face before he could even ask what was wrong. They stood in her small living room while Nana Joy took Miles to his room, giving them privacy for what was clearly going to be a difficult conversation. "Am I just someone you help?" Stella whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Someone you feel sorry for. A project to make yourself feel better about having too much money. Clay's face went pale. What? No. Stella, where is this coming from? Your friend, Marcus. He called me your nanny. Said. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't repeat the words without falling apart completely. Jesus. Clay ran his hands through his hair, fury and guilt warring on his face. Stella, listen to me. Marcus is an idiot. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know us. He sees the world in terms of transactions and assumptions because that's all he's capable of seeing. But is he wrong? Stella pressed, needing to know even though the answer might destroy her. Be honest, Clay. When you look at me, do you see someone worth loving, or do you see someone who needs fixing? Clay stepped forward, taking her gently by the shoulders, waiting until she met his eyes before speaking. I see someone extraordinary, he said with absolute conviction. I see a woman who works 2 jobs to give her son a better life. I see someone who reads to children with such passion that she makes them believe in magic. I see courage and grace and a strength that humbles me every single day. I fell for you, Stella, not because I wanted to help you or save you or fix anything. I fell for you because you're remarkable exactly as you are. The tears came harder then, but different. Not tears of pain, but of relief, of being seen, of being valued not for what she needed, but for who she was. Clay held her while she cried, and Nana Joy watched from the doorway with knowing eyes, her own mother heart recognizing. The moment when 2 people finally stop circling each other and start moving in the same direction. Marcus should never have said those things, Clay continued, his voice rough with emotion. And I'm going to make sure he knows that. But Stella, you have to know, you have to believe, that what we have is real. It's not about money or help or obligation. It's about 2 people who found each other at the right time, when they both needed someone to see them clearly. Stella pulled back enough to look at him, studying his face like she was memorizing it, like she was deciding something fundamental about her future. I want to believe that, she said softly. I want to believe this is real. It is, Clay promised. Let me prove it to you. Every day, for as long as you'll let me. Let me prove it. And in that moment, surrounded by the modest walls of her apartment, with her mother's hand resting gently on her shoulder and her heart cracked open by honesty and fear and hope all tangled together, Stella made a choice. She chose to trust. She chose to risk. She chose to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be built on a foundation of kindness rather than need. She chose Clay. But here's what neither of them understood yet, what they couldn't possibly know as they held each other. In that small living room while spring turned to summer outside, that choice was just the beginning. The easy part, the real test, the moment that would define whether their foundation was solid enough to hold weight, was still coming. And it would arrive wrapped in morning sickness and a positive pregnancy test and all the complicated joy that comes from creating life when you weren't planning to. Summer hit Minneapolis like a blessing. Long daylight hours, warm breezes carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Children's laughter echoing through parks and playgrounds. For Clay and Stella, everything felt different now, blessed. They'd survived the trial of honesty and come out stronger. They were no longer just friends. They were no longer just dating. They were building something real, something that looked like a future. They attended church together on Sundays, Clay sitting between Stella and Nana. Joy, while Miles colored in his children's bulletin with solemn concentration. Classmates and neighbors remarked on how happy Stella looked, how the worry lines around her eyes had softened. Clay's assistant noticed he was leaving the office at reasonable hours, actually taking weekends off, smiling at his phone in meetings like a teenager with his first crush. The shift was palpable, obvious, undeniable. One warm evening in late June, after Miles had been tucked into bed and the house had settled into quiet, Clay and Stella found themselves alone on the porch swing. They sat close together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, listening to the symphony of crickets and distant traffic and their own synchronized breathing. Tell me something you've never told anyone, Stella said softly, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his hand. Clay thought for a moment, I want to use my money for something that actually matters, he admitted. Not just donations and tax write-offs. I want to support causes that change lives. Education programs, housing initiatives, things that give people real opportunities, not just temporary relief. That's beautiful, Stella murmured. You should do it. What about you? Clay asked. What's your secret dream? Stella was quiet for so long, he thought maybe she'd fallen asleep. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to go back to school, get my teaching certification, work with kids who are like I was, kids who think books are luxuries instead of necessities. I want to show them that stories can be doorways to better lives. Clay's chest tightened with emotion. You'd be an incredible teacher. It's just a dream, though, with miles and work and… Dreams are meant to come true, Clay interrupted gently. Let me help make that happen. Clay, not as charity, he said quickly, as an investment in someone I believe in someone I… He paused, the words catching. In someone I love. Stella sat up, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were bright in the dim porch light, searching his face. You love me? Yes, Clay said simply, because it was the truth, and the truth was surprisingly easy when it mattered. I love you. I love Miles. I love the life we're building together. I love who I am when I'm with you. She kissed him then. Not their first kiss. They'd shared tentative, testing kisses over the past few weeks, gentle explorations of what this thing between them could become. But this kiss was different, deeper, a claiming, a promise. I love you too, Stella whispered against his lips. I didn't think I could, I didn't think I should, but I do. What happened next unfolded with the natural inevitability of two people who'd been circling each other for months, two people who, built trust word by word and moment by moment, two people who finally stopped being afraid of what wanting each other might mean. Clay brushed a loose curl from Stella's face, his touch reverent. Only if you want to, he said softly, giving her every opportunity to say no, to slow down, to protect herself. But Stella had spent years protecting herself, years building walls and maintaining distance and refusing to need anyone, because needing meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant potential pain. She was tired of being careful, tired of being afraid. I want you, she said clearly, holding his gaze. I want this. They made love that night with patience and tenderness, and the particular intensity. That comes from truly seeing another person and being seen in return. It was sacred. It was gentle. It was an affirmation of everything they'd built together. The trust, the honesty, the choice to be vulnerable in a world that punishes vulnerability. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Stella's small bedroom, listening to each other breathe, feeling the weight of what had shifted between them. This wasn't just physical. This was a commitment, a statement, a bridge crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Stay, Stella whispered into the darkness. Always, Clay promised, pulling her closer. And for a while, for those perfect summer weeks when everything felt possible and nothing felt complicated, they lived in that promise. They became inseparable. Clay attended Miles's preschool performances. Stella met Clay's mother, Margaret, who embraced her with warmth that felt like acceptance. They talked about futures and possibilities. They laughed more than either had laughed in years. They built something beautiful. Until the morning Stella woke up nauseous. At first, she dismissed it. Summer flu, maybe. Something she ate. Stress from work. But when the nausea persisted day after day, when she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with Miles's early mornings or her job's demands, when her body started signaling something she wasn't ready to acknowledge, Stella knew. She bought a pregnancy test on her lunch break, hiding it in her purse like contraband. She took it in the staff bathroom at the library, hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. And when those two pink lines appeared, clear and undeniable and life-altering, Stella's first emotion wasn't joy. It was fear. She'd been careful. They'd been careful. How had this happened? What would Clay think? What would her mother say? How could she possibly handle another child when she was barely managing with one? The question spiraled through her mind like a hurricane, destroying every careful plan she'd made for her future. That night, Stella told Nana Joy first. Her mother held her while she cried, stroking her hair the way she'd done when Stella was a little girl with scraped knees and hurt feelings. "If it's love, it will grow," Nana Joy whispered. "Trust that. Trust him." But trust felt like the hardest thing in the world right then. Clay was supposed to come over for dinner that Friday. Stella prepared his favorite meal, her mother's recipe for jambalaya that filled the small kitchen with warm, spicy smells that would have made her mouth water if the nausea hadn't been constant now. She set the table carefully, put on a dress that made her feel pretty despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach, rehearsed what she was going to say 100 different ways, none of which felt right. When Clay arrived, dressed casually and smelling like summer rain, carrying flowers for Stella and a new book for Miles, she almost lost her nerve. He was so happy, so present, so completely unprepared for what she was about to tell him. They ate dinner mostly in silence, Stella pushing food around her plate while Clay chatted with Nana Joy about a community center renovation project he was funding. Miles babbled about his day at preschool, oblivious to the tension thrumming through his mother's body. After dinner, after Miles was in bed, after Nana Joy tactfully retreated to her room, Stella and Clay finally found themselves alone in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" Clay asked immediately, because he'd learned to read her silence. "You've been quiet all night." Stella's eyes filled with tears. She gestured for him to sit at the small kitchen table, then took the chair across from him. Distance. She needed distance for this conversation, even though her body wanted nothing more than to curl into his arms and let him make everything okay. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "And I need you to just listen until I'm done. Can you do that?" Clay's face went serious. He nodded, taking her hands across the table. "I'm pregnant," Stella said, the words tumbling out in a rush before she lost her courage. "I know we were careful. I know this wasn't planned. I know this changes everything. I know you probably weren't thinking about—" She was spiraling now, panicking, making her words come faster, defending against rejection before it could land. "Stella," Clay interrupted gently, squeezing her hands. "Breathe." She sucked in air, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm pregnant," she said again, quieter this time, "with your baby. And I don't know what to do. I don't know what you want. I don't know." Clay stood up abruptly, and for one terrible moment, Stella thought he was going to leave, though he was going to walk out just like her ex-husband had, just like every fear she'd ever had about trusting someone was going to be validated right here in her mother's kitchen. But instead, Clay moved around the table and pulled Stella to her feet, holding her shoulders gently, making her look at him. And what she saw in his eyes wasn't fear or anger or resentment. It was wonder. "This is wonderful," he whispered, his own eyes bright with emotion. A surprise, yes, completely unexpected, absolutely. "But Stella," his voice broke, "this is wonderful. We can do this together. You're not angry?" "Angry?" Clay laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. "I'm terrified. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know the first thing about being a father. But angry? No. How can I be angry about creating life with someone I love?" He turned up the quiet music that had been playing in the background, some old R&B song Nana Joy loved, and pulled Stella into an impromptu dance around the cramped kitchen. She laughed through her tears, letting him spin her carefully, letting herself feel the joy underneath the fear. "We're having a baby," Clay said, and he was grinning now, the reality sinking in. "We're having a baby." And in that moment, in that humble kitchen that smelled like jambalaya, and hope, with music playing and two hearts learning what it meant to choose each other, not just in the easy moments, but in the terrifying, life-altering ones too, Stella finally let herself believe it. This was real. This was lasting. This was love. But as they swayed together in the kitchen, both of them floating in the surreal joy of unexpected news, neither could know what challenges still lay ahead. Neither could predict how the world would respond to their growing family. Neither understood yet that building a life together would require more than just love. It would require courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to choosing each other every single day. The foundation was strong, but the real test of whether it could hold weight was just beginning. Can they build something permanent from kindness and trust? Can a love that started with a stranger paying a grocery bill survive the scrutiny of families, communities, and their own deepest fears? The answer would come, but first, they had to be brave enough to keep building. So, here's the question that kept both of them awake at night. Can love that begins with a small act of kindness survive the weight of real life? Because pregnancy isn't a fairy tale. It's morning sickness and swollen ankles and medical appointments that cost more than groceries. It's fear disguised as excitement and excitement disguised as fear. And for Stella and Clay, it was also a test. The kind that reveals whether your foundation is built on solid ground or just wishful thinking. The months that followed that kitchen revelation unfolded in a rhythm of ordinary miracles and quiet challenges. Clay took time off work, actual time, not just the perfunctory I'll check emails from home that wealthy men call balance. He accompanied Stella to every doctor's appointment, sitting in uncomfortable waiting room chairs designed for people half his size, holding her hand through ultrasounds that showed a tiny heartbeat flickering like a promise on grainy screens. He asked questions the doctors probably found annoying. What does that measurement mean? Is that growth rate normal? What should we be watching for? He wasn't just present. He was engaged, invested, all in. And people noticed. The thing about small communities, even in cities as large as Minneapolis, is that people talk. Stella's church community, the same congregation where she'd sat every Sunday since childhood, watched this relationship unfold with opinions they weren't shy about sharing. Some of those opinions were beautiful. Sister Martha organized a baby shower that filled the church basement with laughter and gifts. Tiny. Onesies and board books and handmade blankets knitted with prayers woven into every stitch. The young mothers in the reading program brought meals, showing up at Stella's door with casseroles and encouragement, telling her she deserved this happiness, that they'd been praying for her to find someone who saw her worth. But other opinions cut deeper. Whispers in the church parking lot about moving too fast, about getting pregnant before marriage, about whether Clay's intentions were genuine or just wealthy white guilt playing out in real time. Stella heard them. Of course she heard them. And every whispered judgment was a tiny knife against the armor she'd spent years building around her heart. Clay faced his own scrutiny. His colleagues, the ones who'd known him as the driven entrepreneur who lived for quarterly reports and market share, couldn't reconcile this new version of him. The one who left meetings early for prenatal classes. The one who turned down business trips because Stella needed him home. Marcus, despite a thorough dressing down from Clay after the nanny incident, still made awkward comments disguised as jokes. Guess you're really committing to this domestic thing, huh? He'd say, like choosing family over profit margins was somehow embarrassing. But here's what mattered. Every time the world pushed back, Clay and Stella pushed forward together. They attended parenting classes at the community center on Tuesday evenings, sitting in a circle with other expectant parents who ranged from terrified teenagers to confident 40-somethings having their fourth child. Clay was the only man there who wasn't married to the woman beside him, and he felt every sideways glance. But he'd show up week after week, taking notes during the breastfeeding lecture, and asking earnest questions about swaddling techniques, and gradually the other parents stopped seeing him as an outsider and started seeing him as just another scared father to be trying to figure out how not to break a tiny human. Stella bloomed during pregnancy, not in the Instagram perfect way where women wear designer, maternity clothes and never get stretch marks, but in a real, earthy, powerful way. Her body changed. Her confidence grew. She felt, for maybe the first time in her adult life, like she wasn't fighting the world alone. Like she had a partner who wouldn't disappear when things got hard. And things did get hard. 24 weeks into the pregnancy, Stella started having contractions. False labor, the doctors assured them, but frightening enough to land her on partial bed rest for 3 weeks. Clay moved into her small apartment, officially, permanently, without asking permission or worrying about propriety. He slept on the couch those first few nights until Nana Joy, practical as always, told him he was being ridiculous and to just share Stella's bed like the adults they were. He took over Miles's morning routine. Breakfast, getting dressed, drop off at preschool. He learned to braid hair badly, but with such earnest effort that Miles would giggle at his lopsided attempts. He cooked dinner every night, following recipes from his grandmother's old cookbook that he'd kept boxed away for years. And every evening he'd sit beside Stella on the bed, reading aloud to her and her growing belly, sometimes children's books, sometimes novels, once even a software manual when Stella joked that the baby should know what their father did for a living. "You're good at this," Stella told him one night, her hand resting on her stomach where the baby was doing what felt like gymnastics. "At reading manuals," Clay teased. "At showing up," she said seriously. "At being present. At choosing us." Clay set the book aside and took her hand. "It's not a choice anymore," he said quietly. "You're my family. This is where I belong." But belonging, real belonging, requires more than just deciding you want it. It requires acceptance from the people who matter, which is why the dinner with Clay's mother Margaret felt less like a meal and more like a trial. Margaret Spencer was a formidable woman in her early 60s who'd raised Clay alone after his father left, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep him in good schools, who'd taught him that success was important, but character was everything. She was gracious and warm and deeply protective of her only child. When Clay called to tell her about the pregnancy, her silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to make his stomach drop. "Well," she'd finally said, her voice carefully neutral, "that's certainly news." The Sunday dinner invitation came a week later. Formal, unavoidable, the kind of summons you don't refuse. Stella wore her best maternity dress, the navy blue one that made her feel less like a whale and more like a woman who had her life together, even though her life felt like it was held together with hope and duct tape. Clay held her hand the entire drive to his mother's house in the suburbs, his palms sweaty despite the air conditioning. "She's going to love you," he kept saying, like a mantra. "You don't know that," Stella replied, her own anxiety making her voice sharper than intended. "I do, actually, because I love you. And my mother taught me to recognize quality when I see it." Margaret's house was beautiful in that understated way that signaled old money and good taste. Nothing ostentatious, just comfortable elegance earned through years of hard work. She greeted them at the door with a smile that Stella couldn't quite read, ushering them inside with polite warmth that could have meant anything. The meal was delicious. The conversation was careful. Margaret asked appropriate questions about Stella's work, about Miles, about her mother. She complimented the library programs and mentioned she'd been a teacher herself before becoming a school administrator. She told stories about Clay as a child that made him blush and Stella laugh. Everything was perfectly pleasant. Too pleasant. Like they were all performing their parts in a play no one had agreed to star in. Finally, over coffee and dessert, while Clay excused himself to take a phone call he couldn't ignore, Margaret looked at Stella directly. Really looked at her, in that way mothers have of seeing straight through social niceties to the truth underneath. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. Stella blinked, surprised by the directness. "Yes," she said honestly. "Very happy. And my son, is he good to you? To your boy?" "He's wonderful," Stella said, emotion making her voice thick. "Better than I thought anyone could be." Margaret nodded slowly, stirring her coffee even though she took it black. "I won't pretend I wasn't surprised by Clay's news," she said carefully. "My son has always been focused, driven, careful about his choices. This, you, the baby, becoming an instant family, it's not what I expected for him." Stella's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The gentle rejection. The polite suggestion that maybe they're moving too fast, maybe they should reconsider. "But," Margaret continued, and something softened in her expression, "I've seen how he looks at you. I've listened to him talk about Miles's preschool performances, and pregnancy cravings, and plans for the nursery. And I've realized something. I've never heard my son sound so absolutely certain about anything in his entire life. She reached across the table and took Stella's hand. You make him happy, real happy, not just successful happy. And for a mother, that's everything. Stella's eyes filled with tears. I'm going to take good care of him, she promised. I know you will, Margaret said simply. And he's going to take care of you. That's what family does. When Clay returned from his call, he found his mother and his girlfriend, partner. Really, though they hadn't defined it, laughing together over photo albums, Margaret showing Stella pictures of a gap-toothed young Clay covered in mud, both of them relaxed in a way that made his chest tight with gratitude. They had passed the test, not because they were perfect, but because they were real. September arrived with that particular quality of light that signals endings and beginnings. Summer fading into autumn, the world preparing for change. Stella's due date came and went, then came again, because apparently the baby had inherited their mother's stubbornness and was comfortable right where they were, thank you very much. Finally, on a mild afternoon when leaves were just starting to turn gold, Stella's water broke while she was reading to Miles. Clay drove them to the hospital with the kind of controlled panic that comes from having attended too many birthing classes and still feeling completely unprepared for the reality. Nana Joy met them there, calm as always, a steadying presence in the chaos. Labor was long, painful, undignified in all the ways the parenting books warn you about, but you don't really understand until you're living it. Clay stayed beside Stella the entire time, letting her squeeze his hand hard enough to leave bruises, whispering encouragement, even when she told him in very explicit terms exactly where he could shove his encouragement. He didn't leave, not to eat, not to rest, not when the nurses suggested he might want to take a break. He stayed, because that's what showing up means. Nathaniel Thomas Spencer entered the world at 3:47 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a cry that filled the quiet hospital room with new life. Clay cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face in a way he didn't bother to hide. The nurse placed Nathaniel on Stella's chest, and the exhausted mother looked down at her son, their son, with an expression of such profound love and relief and joy that Clay felt his entire world shift into focus. This was what mattered, not quarterly reports or profit margins or what anyone else thought about their unconventional path to family. This tiny, perfect human they'd created together. This moment of absolute grace. Miles met his brother later that morning, standing shyly beside the hospital bed, while Nana Joy lifted him up to see. Gentle, Stella instructed, as Miles reached out one curious finger to touch Nathaniel's impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers closed around Miles's, and the toddler's face lit up with wonder. My brother, Miles announced proudly. Your brother, Clay confirmed, his arm around Miles's shoulders. Family, chosen and built and earned through showing up, day after day, in the big moments and the small ones. The year that followed was a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles and figuring out how to balance 2 children with 2 careers and 1 relationship that was still finding its footing. Clay officially moved into a new house he'd bought, not in the wealthy suburbs where his mother lived, but in Stella's neighborhood, close to Nana Joy and the community that had become his community too. It was a modest house by his standards, but it had 4 bedrooms and a backyard where Miles could play and space for all of them to grow. Stella went back to work part-time, then enrolled in night classes to get her teaching certification. Clay restructured his role at the company, promoting Marcus, who'd finally learned to keep his opinions to himself, to handle day-to-day operations, while Clay focused on the charitable initiatives he'd always dreamed about. They were building something, not just a relationship, but a life with purpose and meaning and enough love to fill all the spaces that had been empty before. And then, one ordinary Saturday morning, exactly 1 year after Nathaniel's birth, Clay asked Stella to marry him, not with a grand gesture or a surprise flash mob or a ring hidden in champagne. Just the 2 of them sitting on the back porch while the boys napped inside, drinking coffee and watching autumn leaves fall in the yard they now shared. "I want to marry you," Clay said simply. No preamble, no smooth speech. "Not because we have kids together, or because it's what people expect. I want to marry you because I want to spend every day for the rest of my life choosing you, choosing us, choosing this family we've built from kindness and trust, and showing up even when it's hard." Stella looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, a smile playing at her lips. "That's a terrible proposal," she said. "I know. I'm really bad at this. You should probably try again." So Clay got down on one knee right there on the porch. No ring yet, because he'd wanted her input. On that, wanted her to choose something she actually liked, rather than something he guessed at. And he asked her properly, "Stella, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." They married 3 months later in the same small church where Sister Martha had organized the baby shower, surrounded by everyone who mattered. Nana Joy stood beside Stella as her matron of honor. Margaret stood beside Clay, beaming with pride. Miles was the ring bearer, taking his job so seriously he nearly tripped over his own feet. Nathaniel, held by his grandmother during the ceremony, babbled what everyone chose to interpret as approval. The reception was loud and joyful, and nothing like the elegant affairs Clay's colleagues probably expected. There was fried chicken and collard greens alongside the catered food. There was gospel music and R&B, and that one country song Margaret insisted on because it had been her wedding song 40 years ago. There was dancing and laughter and toasts that made people cry and jokes that made them laugh. And at the end of the night, when the guests had gone home and the boys were asleep at Nana Joy's house, Clay and Stella stood on the porch of their home, their actual home, the one they'd chosen together, and looked at what they'd built. "You know," Clay said softly, his arms wrapped around his wife. His wife, that word still felt new and perfect, used to think money could solve everything, could buy happiness or purpose or meaning. "And then I met you in that grocery store, counting coins, and I learned the most valuable lesson of my life." "What's that?" Stella asked, leaning back against his chest. "That the richest thing I could ever do was show up for someone who needed kindness without expecting anything in return. Because that one moment, that tiny, insignificant gesture that I didn't even think twice about, led me here, to you, to us, to a family I didn't know I needed until I had it." Stella turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held their whole story. The struggle and the trust and the choice to keep building even when it was hard. "Love didn't rescue us," she said, echoing words she'd spoken once before. "We built it, day by day, choice by choice. Small act of kindness by small act of kindness. Together," Clay added. "Together," Stella agreed. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the night sounds of their neighborhood, feeling the solid weight of a life well chosen. In the backyard, a swing set Clay had built last month swayed gently in the breeze, waiting for morning when Miles would demand to be pushed higher, higher, while Nathaniel watched from his playpen, already eager to join his big brother in adventure. Inside, 2 bedrooms held 2 sleeping boys who would wake up in a house full of love and presence and the kind of security that doesn't come from money but from knowing you're valued exactly as you are. This wasn't a fairy tale. There was no Prince Charming, no damsel in distress, no magical transformation that fixed everything. This was something better, something real and earned and built on the solid foundation of 2 people who'd learned that love isn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Love is showing up. Love is choosing someone day after day, in the boring moments and the hard moments and the beautiful moments. Love is paying for groceries when no one's watching. Not because you want credit, but because you saw someone who needed kindness and you had kindness to give. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that small act of kindness becomes the first brick in a foundation strong enough to hold everything that matters. Clay and Stella's story isn't about a wealthy man saving a struggling woman. It's about 2 people who saved each other by choosing to build something together. It's about a family created not by accident or obligation, but by daily decisions to show up, to trust, to love, even when it's scary. It's about learning that your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your mistakes or your circumstances. It's measured by how you treat people when no one's keeping score. That's the legacy they're building for Miles and Nathaniel. Not money or status or impressive achievements. Just the simple, powerful lesson that kindness matters. That showing up matters. That choosing to see people's worth, really see it, beyond the surface and the struggle, can change lives, including your own. And as they stood on that porch, holding each other in the gentle darkness, Clay and Stella knew something with absolute certainty. This was just the beginning. Tomorrow there would be laundry and grocery shopping, and Miles's preschool pickup, and Nathaniel, his pediatrician appointment, and 1,000 other ordinary moments that make up a life. There would be disagreements and challenges, and days when they were too tired to be kind to each other. There would be sick kids and work stress, and all the normal complications of building a life together. But they would show up for it, all of it, together. Because that's what love actually looks like, not the fairy tale version. The real version. The one that's built brick by brick, choice by choice, small kindness by small kindness, until you look up one day and realize you've built something that will last. Something worth fighting for. Something worth choosing. Every single day. Now here's my question for you. When was the last time you showed up for someone without expecting anything in return? When did you last offer kindness just because you could, not because you wanted credit or recognition or repayment? This story isn't just about Clay and Stella. It's about all of us. It's about the choice we make every single day to either see people's worth or look past it, to either show up or stay comfortable, to either build bridges or maintain walls. So I want you to do something right now. Think of one person in your life, maybe someone struggling, maybe someone who just needs to know they matter, and do one small act of kindness for them this week. Pay for their coffee. Send an encouraging text. Show up when it's inconvenient. Make the choice to be someone's Clay Spencer moment. Then come back here and tell me about it in the comments. What did you do? How did it feel? Did it change something for you the way it changed Clay? I'm reading every single comment, and I want to hear your story. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that love is built through small, consistent acts of showing up, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's struggling. Someone who's forgotten their worth. Someone who needs to know that kindness still exists in this world. Subscribe for more stories that prove love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up day after day for the people who matter. Because at the end of the day, we're all just looking for someone who sees our worth and chooses to stay. Someone who pays our metaphorical grocery bill not for credit, but because they believe we matter. You matter. Your kindness matters. Your choice to show up matters. Now go prove it.